Hi, I want to talk for just a couple minutes today about what I've been learning in the reading of my book. Let me get it down here for you. It's called Lawrence in Arabia. It is by Scott Anderson about deceit, war, deceit, imperial folly, and the making of the modern Middle East. It's a book I've been actually working on for the past 2 months. I was with my family at Rehoboth Beach back in the beginning of July, and I happened to see it on a bookshelf at a bookstore. I paged through it briefly. I thought, this subject might be a bit dry, but I had just finished watching the movie Lawrence of Arabia, and so I was kind of thinking in that mindset already about World War I history, Middle Eastern history during World War I should say. And so it led me to want to get this book and read it, so I got it out of the library, local library. And a couple of thoughts I've had on the book so far. I'm almost done. I'm on the last chapter. It's called Damascus, and it's the final push into Syria by the British Army with the Arab nationals or the Arab rebels or whatever you want to call them, the Arab armies that are also pushing up from the, I suppose you could say, the eastern side. And what I found reading this book and the things I've learned, one of the fascinating parts of this book that I've really found interesting is British double dealing, British duplicity throughout the war, making multiple deals with multiple sides. Whether they were working with the French on one side with the famous or infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement, or whether they perhaps making promises to the Arabs on the other hand, and if they were also then making promises to the Jews and the Balfour Declaration. So I found it fascinating that there were so many different things going on at so many different times with different groups, and the British had a hard time keeping all these things together and promising different things to different people. And how Lawrence, in this whole role, a bit of a mysterious character, and certainly I don't know if Scott Anderson knows for sure everything that was going on in Lawrence's mind, but he certainly did what he could to demonstrate what he thought was going on, or give his best guess, best analysis, best estimations as to what Lawrence's motivations and passions were, what drove him, and it seemed like that was contradictory at times in terms of what Lawrence really was in this for. So the interesting thing I found about Lawrence in this whole process of duplicity and double dealing is that we're not sure what he told the Arabs and when he told them. Did he tell Faisal early in 1917 or whenever it may have been about Sykes-Picot, or did he not tell him at all, or did he only tell him parts of it? And he didn't tell other Arab leaders, or did he not tell other Arab leaders that he was working with about some of the double dealings that were going on? It's a fascinating study, character study, because again, no one really knows for sure what was going on in Lawrence's mind, what was motivating him. But I found it to be interesting because I think Scott Anderson does a good job of giving an argument for why he feels Lawrence did something a certain way. So if Lawrence, let's say for example, he makes an argument why he thinks Lawrence told Faisal about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and I think he makes some good arguments for that in the book as to Lawrence's change in his behavior and some of the ways he was very coy about some of the things he said to biographers after the war was over. He didn't perhaps want to say that he had given up British state secrets before they were made public, and so I found that to be very interesting. If you watch the film Lawrence of Arabia, you come away from that film thinking perhaps that Lawrence is a bit of a liar, or a bit double-sided, a bit of a hypocrite, and really didn't tell the Arabs what he was doing and was just a bit of a megalomaniac and a bit of a kingmaker perhaps. But what I found from this book was perhaps Scott Anderson's argument that Lawrence was probably trying to do two things. One, he was trying to play kingmaker and give the Arabs a chance for their independence and helping them in that endeavor because he believed in that endeavor, number one. Number two, he didn't like the fact that the British were, from what he could see, being dishonest. And the word of a British gentleman, a British soldier, British military, British government, if you will, carried a lot of weight back then. Your word was your bond, so to speak. At least, again, reading this book, that's the sense I got. And then seeing Lawrence feel like that wasn't being carried out and that he had to do what he could to encourage honesty on his part and demonstrate on his part that I'm going to stand up and do what's right, and I'm not going to double deal with these Arabs. I'm not going to stab them in the back. I'm going to support them, work with them. The interesting thing is he still seemed to be not completely honest, and I was just reading recently in this book, I believe in the second to last chapter, about how he felt that he was not being forthright. He was leading a bit of a double life, or a bit of a sham with some of the leaders he was working with, not being fully honest with them. But the one underlying factor, regardless of whether he was fully honest with them, is that he seemed to focus on understanding that the Arabs had to take land on their own if they were going to gain any independence. They couldn't rely on the French or the British to take over a place and then give it to the Arabs, and that would be an independent Arab land. The Arab would have to take for themselves what they wanted. So if they wanted Damascus, let's say, or if they had wanted Amman or even Aqaba. If any of those places they wanted, they probably are going to have to be there and take it themselves. And I think that was the thing that I learned the most in reading this book, that seemed to be his motivation. I'm also amazed by the fact that Lawrence didn't seem to follow orders when he didn't want to. If he got, and word traveled slow at the time, it's not like it is today. But obviously if they send messages and wires to him, cables and different messages, he seemed to ignore it or just pretend he didn't get it, just outright defy it. And when he didn't want to be bothered, he went off in the desert in the interior somewhere where nobody could reach him. And that's the way he got away with not having to worry about British giving him orders he didn't want to follow. So it's been a fascinating read. I'm almost done. I have, I think, 40 pages left, and I'm a slow reader, so it's taken me over 2 months to tackle this thing. But I've enjoyed it tremendously. I'm looking forward to reading the next book in this series, if you will, if you can call it that. Not that it is. Scott Anderson, I don't believe, wrote a follow-up companion piece to this book, but I'm interested in reading a book called 1919, 6 Months That Changed the World. I don't know the author off the top of my head, but it's on my summer reading list. Granted, it is now September 6th, so summer's pretty much over, and I've read one book on my, I think, 9-book summer reading list, but I like to challenge myself, and so it's something fun. I've enjoyed reading it, looking forward to the next phase, the next chapter, learning how a lot of the decisions made in 1918, 1917, 1918, 1919, 1920 probably impacted our world today and the modern Middle East more than any other decision going forward from there. It's amazing to think what might have happened had they made some different choices and different decisions. Would we have had different outcomes? Would we have had different allies in the regions? Would we have had different enemies? Would we have had some of the same enemies at all? It's hard to say. And one last thing I will leave you with. I found it also quite interesting. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, not exactly what it was made out to be. An agreement that the French and British made secretly. It was widely known after the Russians released the information, once the Bolsheviks released the information, once they overthrew the Tsarist government, and I guess the Whites, was it they were the Whites or the Reds? I can't remember that. But anyway, they overthrew the government that was in place after the Tsar had abdicated, and they released these documents. But the modern Middle East was ultimately not founded on that original agreement. There were changes. I think it was the San Juan Conference, maybe? San something conference that ultimately did that. I haven't quite got to that part yet, but my understanding is the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as it stood, was not the reason for the divisions that occurred. It was perhaps a precursor to that, but it wasn't the actual permanency of those borders. And I find it fascinating, and it's interesting when you hear ISIS reference the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It's perhaps a catch-all term, and I heard this on a podcast a number of months ago. It's perhaps a catch-all term for the division of modern Middle Eastern borders, which really weren't necessarily from the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but perhaps that's where it got its start. So an interesting aside and something I look forward to reading into more. And again, enjoyed this book tremendously. Looking forward to the next one, Paris 1919. And if I need something a little lighter in the meantime, I perhaps might read Where We're Going, We Don't Need Roads, the story of the making of the Back to the Future trilogy. Should be exciting. Thank you very much, and have a great day.